Mark lived in a small but peaceful neighborhood that was managed by the Homeowners Association, or HOA as people often called it. For 8 years, he had enjoyed a quiet life in his brick house at the corner of the street. He liked his home. The fence around the yard had been there since he moved in, the grass was trimmed, and the old oak tree in front of the house gave him shade in the summer. Everything about his home felt calm and ordinary, and he had never once received a complaint from anyone. One warm afternoon, as he returned home from work, Mark noticed something taped to his front door. It was a folded paper with bold black letters across the top. The words made him stop in his tracks. It read, "Violation Notice." For a moment, he thought maybe it had been placed on the wrong house, but as he read further, he realized the letter was meant for him. The notice claimed that his fence was out of alignment with community standards and that he had 10 days to correct it. If he failed to do so, he would face fines. Mark stared at the letter, shaking his head. His fence was strong, neat, and freshly painted last summer. It had never caused trouble, and he knew many of his neighbors had fences that looked far worse. At first, Mark decided not to worry too much. He thought it might be a mistake that would soon be cleared up. But only 2 days later, as he was watering his front garden, 2 men walked up his driveway. One wore a gray suit and carried a clipboard, while the other wore a white shirt with a small badge clipped to it. "Good afternoon," the man in the suit said in a formal tone. "We are inspectors from the Homeowners Association. We're here to follow up on the violation notice regarding your property." Mark set down the watering can and looked at them calmly. "My fence is not breaking any rules. It is in good condition." The man in the white shirt adjusted his glasses and spoke sharply. "According to our inspection, your fence is not in compliance with the standards we require. If it is not corrected, fines will be issued." The man in the suit added, "And if fines are ignored, our legal department will take action. You could face serious consequences." Mark stood silently for a moment, studying their expressions. He could tell they were used to people becoming nervous or apologetic. They expected him to argue or to beg for leniency. Instead, he simply nodded. "I understand," he said, before turning back toward his house. He did not slam the door, but he closed it firmly, leaving the inspectors outside. Inside, however, his mind was racing. He was not the kind of man who liked conflict, but he also did not like being threatened. He had paid his dues on time every year. He had followed the community rules. And he knew for certain that his fence was not breaking any of them. If these men wanted to push him around, they would learn he was not so easy to intimidate. That evening, Mark sat down at his desk and pulled out the thick handbook of community rules that every homeowner received when they moved in. He flipped through the pages carefully. He looked for any mention of fence height, color, or alignment. He read every line, underlined important phrases, and compared them with the notice he had received. The more he read, the more he realized that his fence fully complied with the written standards. There was no rule that said the fence had to be moved or changed. In fact, several neighbors had fences that were older, leaning, or unpainted, and yet none of them had received notices. That fact made him more certain. Either this was a mistake, or the inspectors were trying to use authority to control him unfairly. Mark leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. He was a quiet man, but he was also determined. If they wanted to send letters, he would answer them with facts. If they wanted to send lawyers, he would meet them in court. He had no intention of paying for something that was not wrong. Later that night, he spoke with his neighbor Anna, who lived across the street. She listened carefully as he explained what had happened. Her eyes widened in surprise. "That doesn't make sense," she said. "Your fence looks better than mine. If they're calling yours a violation, then half the street should be in trouble." Her words encouraged Mark even more. He realized he was not alone, and that others saw the unfairness too. As he went back inside, he felt a new sense of calm. The inspectors thought they could frighten him with threats, but they had underestimated him. He was ready to stand his ground, and if the matter reached the courtroom, he knew he would not walk in unprepared. The next week started quietly, but Mark knew it would not stay that way for long. He had replied to the violation notice with a short letter, where he politely explained that his fence was not breaking any written rule. He had even included page numbers and quotes from the handbook that supported his point. He thought maybe that would be enough to close the matter. However, on Friday morning, he heard a knock on his door. When he opened it, the same two inspectors stood there again. The man in the gray suit gave a tight smile. "We received your letter, Mr. Mark. Unfortunately, it does not change our decision. The fence remains a violation." Mark held the door but did not step aside. "Show me the rule I broke," he said calmly. The inspector's smile faded. "We do not have to show you. We have authority from the association. If you refuse to comply, fines will begin immediately." The man in the white shirt added, "And if you continue to ignore, lawyers will take over the matter. That will be far more expensive than fixing the fence." For a moment, silence filled the porch. Mark studied their faces and saw something new. They were not only confident, they were also irritated. His letter had not been the answer they expected. Most people gave up quickly when threatened with lawyers. They had likely assumed Mark would simply pay or stay quiet. Instead, he had challenged them with their own handbook. "I will not change a fence that is not breaking any rule," Mark answered firmly. "If you want to fine me, go ahead. But I will not pay for something that is not wrong." The inspectors exchanged a glance. Then the man in the suit straightened his shoulders. "Very well. Expect a fine in the mail. And remember, our lawyers will not be as patient as we are." They turned and walked away. Mark closed the door gently. He did not shout, and he did not slam the door. But inside, he felt a mix of frustration and determination. He knew what was coming next, and he was already preparing for it. That evening, he visited Anna again across the street. She was watering her flowers when he told her about the second visit. Her eyes filled with anger. "This is unfair. They cannot just make up rules. You should not face this alone, Mark. Maybe we should talk to more neighbors." Together, they spoke with several others on the block. One man named David admitted that he too had received a strange notice about his garage door, even though it was freshly painted. Another woman named Clara said she had been fined for the color of her mailbox, though the handbook never listed mailbox colors. As the conversations continued, a pattern became clear. The HOA inspectors were targeting people unfairly, using vague reasons to demand changes or fines. Mark listened carefully to every story. He realized this was not just about his fence anymore. The inspectors had been using threats to control many families in the neighborhood. Most people paid the fines simply to avoid conflict, even though the rules did not support those fines. "Maybe they choose easy targets," Clara said softly. "People who do not like to argue. They scare us with words like lawyers and court." Mark nodded. "That is exactly what they want. But if someone stands up to them, the truth will come out." That night, Mark went home and began his plan. He made copies of the handbook, highlighted the sections about fences, and organized every document he had. He even printed photos of his fence, showing it was straight, painted, and in perfect condition. He placed everything neatly into a folder. He knew a letter would not be enough anymore. The inspectors had already decided to push this further. If they wanted a fight in court, he would make sure he was ready. A week later, as expected, another envelope arrived in his mailbox. This one was heavier than the first. When Mark opened it, he found a fine of $500 for property violation, along with a warning that if he did not pay within 30 days, the matter would be handed to legal representatives. Mark smiled faintly as he read the letter. They were moving exactly as he thought they would. Instead of fear, he felt steady. He placed the fine into his folder along with the other documents. The inspectors wanted to frighten him with big words, but all they had done was give him more evidence for the future. Later that evening, Anna asked him how he felt about the fine. Mark looked at her and said calmly, "I will not pay. They want me to break, but I will not. If they bring lawyers, I will face them. And when we stand before a judge, the truth will not hide." For the first time, Anna smiled with relief. "Then you are not only standing for yourself, Mark. You are standing for all of us." As the sun set over the quiet street, Mark sat on his porch with his folder of documents beside him. The inspectors thought they were stronger, but he knew something they did not. The law was on his side, and the courtroom would soon prove it. 2 weeks passed, and the summer heat grew stronger. Mark kept living his routine life, but he knew the issue with the HOA was not over. Every day, he checked his mailbox carefully, expecting another letter. When the envelope finally came, it was larger than before and stamped with the logo of a law office. He carried it inside, sat at his kitchen table, and opened it slowly. The letter inside was written on heavy paper with sharp black print. It stated that he now owed not only the original $500, but also added legal fees. If he refused to pay, the association's lawyers would take the matter to court. Mark read the letter twice. He felt no fear, only a firm sense of purpose. This was the step he had been waiting for. He placed the letter into his growing folder of evidence, then leaned back in his chair. They thought this would make him bend, but instead it gave him the chance to bring the truth to light. Later that evening, he walked across the street to Anna's house. She was sitting on her porch with a glass of iced tea. When she saw him holding the letter, she set the glass down quickly. "They sent it, didn't they?" she asked. Mark nodded. "Yes. They want to add fees now. They want me to pay almost $1,000. But I will not pay. I will let them take me to court." Anna frowned. "That sounds serious, Mark. Court is not easy." "I know," he said, "but I have the rules on my side. They cannot win with false claims." Word began to spread around the neighborhood. Soon, more neighbors visited Mark to share their own stories. David showed him 2 fines he had paid for his garage door, even though the handbook said nothing about door colors. Clara showed him photos of her mailbox, which was perfectly ordinary, yet she had been fined as well. The more Mark listened, the clearer the picture became. The inspectors were not just unfair to him. They had been unfair to many. One evening, the neighbors gathered in Anna's yard. About 10 people came, each bringing their notices and fines. They spread the papers out on a table, and the sight was shocking. Dozens of letters, fines, and warnings lay side by side. Some were for fences, others for lawns, garages, or mailboxes. Yet most had no real rule behind them. "They are using fear," Clara said softly. "They scare us with words like violation and lawyer. And most of us pay because we do not want trouble." Mark studied the pile of papers. "If we show this to a judge, the truth will be clear. They cannot explain why so many people were fined for things not listed in the handbook." The neighbors nodded. For the first time, they felt hope. They saw in Mark someone willing to fight, and that gave them courage. A week later, the official court notice arrived. The association had indeed filed a claim against Mark. The letter ordered him to appear in court at the county building 2 towns away. Many people would have panicked at such a letter, but Mark felt calm. This was the moment he had prepared for. He spent his evenings going through every detail. He organized the handbook rules with markers and sticky notes. He arranged photos of his fence in order. He made copies of every letter, every fine, and every page. He even created a binder so nothing would be lost. On the night before the court date, Mark sat at his desk and looked over his binder one last time. He thought about the inspectors, their sharp voices, and their threats. He thought about his neighbors who had been afraid for so long. Then he closed the binder gently. He was not only fighting for his own fence. He was fighting for everyone who had been pushed down by unfair treatment. The morning of the hearing came bright and clear. Mark dressed neatly, put his binder under his arm, and drove to the courthouse. Anna and David followed in another car, wanting to support him. Even Clara came, holding her folder of mailbox letters. They were not required to be there, but they wanted to show that Mark was not alone. When Mark stepped into the courthouse lobby, he saw the inspectors for the first time without their clipboards. They stood beside a tall man in a dark suit who looked every bit the lawyer they had promised. The inspectors noticed Mark but quickly turned away. The lawyer gave a small smirk, as though he expected the day to be easy. Mark, however, felt steady. He greeted his neighbors, thanked them for coming, and then walked toward the courtroom doors. Inside, the judge would hear the truth. Inside, the inspectors would no longer control the story. As he entered the courtroom, Mark took a deep breath. He was ready. The courtroom was cool and quiet when Mark stepped inside. Wooden benches lined both sides, and at the front stood the judge's bench, tall and solid. The air smelled faintly of polish and paper. Mark walked slowly toward the front row of benches, his binder tucked under his arm. Anna, David, and Clara sat behind him, giving small nods of support. On the other side of the room, the two inspectors sat with their lawyer. The lawyer wore a dark suit and polished shoes, his briefcase placed neatly on the table. He leaned toward the inspectors and spoke in a low voice, but his confident smile showed he expected an easy victory. The inspectors looked less certain. Their faces were pale, and they kept glancing at Mark as though trying to guess what he had prepared. The bailiff called for order, and soon the judge entered. She was a calm woman with sharp eyes who looked like she had heard many cases before. Everyone stood, then sat again when she took her seat. The lawyer for the association rose first. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "this case is simple. The homeowner, Mr. Mark, has failed to comply with the association's standards regarding property appearance. He has ignored notices and refused to correct violations. We seek enforcement of fines and recovery of legal fees." He spoke with confidence, moving his hands in practiced motions. When he finished, he sat down as though the matter was already decided. The judge turned her gaze to Mark. "Mr. Mark, how do you respond?" Mark stood slowly, holding his binder. His voice was calm but clear. "Your Honor, I respect the court. I also respect fair rules. But in this case, I have broken no rule. My fence is in perfect condition and meets every requirement written in the handbook of the Homeowners Association. I have brought the handbook and documents to prove this." He placed the binder on the table and opened it carefully. Page by page, he showed the judge the sections of the handbook that listed fence rules. He pointed out the allowed height, color, and placement, all of which matched his fence exactly. He also showed photos of his yard, taken from several angles, proving the fence was straight, neat, and freshly painted. The judge leaned forward, studying the documents with care. "And you say these are the official rules?" she asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Mark replied. "This is the handbook every homeowner receives?" "I followed every word." The lawyer from the association shifted in his seat. He cleared his throat and spoke again. "Your Honor, while the handbook is one guide, the association has additional standards that evolve to maintain the value of the neighborhood. The inspectors have the right to interpret these standards." Mark did not raise his voice, but his words were steady. "If there are additional standards, then they must be written and shared with the homeowners. I received nothing beyond this handbook. Without written rules, the inspectors cannot invent violations. They cannot demand money for something that does not exist in writing. The judge raised her eyebrows at the lawyer. Do you have these additional standards in writing? The lawyer hesitated. He glanced at the inspectors, who looked down at their hands. Finally, he said, at this time, we do not have the full documentation present, but the inspector's judgment should be trusted. The judge's expression grew firm. This court cannot enforce invisible rules. If a standard is not written and distributed, it cannot be applied. Homeowners must know exactly what is required of them. Otherwise, enforcement becomes unfair. The room grew quiet. Mark stood still, waiting. His neighbors sat straighter on the bench, their eyes wide. The inspectors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mark then spoke again. Your Honor, I would also like to add that I am not alone. Several neighbors have been fined for matters not listed in the handbook. They have paid because they were afraid of legal threats. Some of them are here today. The judge looked toward the benches. Anna and David rose slowly, holding their own folders. Clara lifted her hand as well. The judge nodded to them. You may not all testify today, but your presence is noted. The lawyer tried to object, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. This is important. If multiple homeowners are being fined without written standards, the issue is larger than one fence. The lawyer's smile had completely vanished. He shuffled his papers, but his case looked thinner by the minute. The inspectors whispered to each other, their faces pale. Mark closed his binder and stood tall. Your Honor, I have no wish to fight the association without reason. I only ask for fairness. If I had broken a rule, I would fix it. But there is no broken rule here. There is only pressure and threats. The judge looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned her gaze to the lawyer and the inspectors. I will review all documents carefully, but I can already see the problem. Written rules must guide this association, not personal opinion. We will continue the session tomorrow with full examination. The gavel struck, ending the day's hearing. As people began to rise, Mark gathered his binder. His neighbors whispered words of encouragement. Across the room, the inspectors looked shaken, while their lawyer tried to hide his frustration. Walking out of the courtroom, Mark felt no pride, only steady resolve. The fight was not over yet, but the truth was finally being heard. And for the first time, the inspectors seemed unsure of themselves. The next morning, Mark returned to the courthouse. He wore the same neat shirt and carried his binder under his arm. The sun was bright, but the air inside the building was cool and still. Anna, David, and Clara walked beside him, and their quiet presence gave him strength. When they entered the courtroom, the inspectors were already there. They looked tired, as though they had not slept well. Their lawyer, however, sat tall with his briefcase open, pretending to be confident. Yet the tightness around his mouth showed the pressure he felt. The judge entered, and the room rose in respect. After everyone sat, she spoke firmly. Yesterday, we reviewed the association's claims and the homeowner's defense. Today, I expect full documentation of the standards being enforced. Without written proof, this court cannot support vague claims. The lawyer cleared his throat and stood. Your Honor, the association operates not only with the handbook but also with evolving guidelines decided by the board. These guidelines are sometimes not written in full detail, but they allow inspectors to protect the community's appearance. The judge leaned forward. Do you have those guidelines with you? The lawyer shuffled through his papers. He produced a thin sheet and handed it to the bailiff. When the judge examined it, her expression hardened. This paper is unsigned, undated, and has no official approval. It cannot serve as a legal standard. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Mark remained calm, waiting for his turn. The inspectors looked at each other nervously, realizing their lawyer's argument was weak. The judge turned toward Mark. Mr. Mark, Do you wish to add anything further? Mark stood with his binder in hand. Yes, Your Honor. I wish to show more evidence that this is not only my problem. Many neighbors have suffered the same treatment. I brought their letters and fines. Some of them are here today to support my words. The judge nodded. You may show the documents. Mark opened his binder and carefully laid out copies of his neighbors' fines. One by one, he explained how each notice had no foundation in the handbook. A garage door color, a mailbox shade, a lawn length, all of these were not written rules. Yet fines had been demanded again and again. The judge studied the documents closely. It seems there is a pattern of enforcement beyond written authority, she said. This is serious. The lawyer quickly rose, his voice louder now. Your Honor, these homeowners agreed to be part of the association when they moved in. They accepted that inspectors could decide what is proper. If we cannot enforce standards, the neighborhood will decline. Mark did not raise his voice. Your Honor, we all want a good neighborhood. We all care for our homes. But rules must be clear, or they become weapons. When people are fined for things not written, they lose trust. That is not protection. That is pressure. Anna stood from the bench, her voice strong. It is true, Your Honor. I was fined for flowers I planted in my yard. The handbook says nothing about flowers. I paid because I was scared. But it was wrong. The judge nodded. Thank you, ma'am. Your words will be considered. The lawyer tried again. These are emotional claims. But the association works for the good of all. Without strong enforcement, property values fall. We must have authority. The judge fixed him with a steady gaze. Authority must come from law, not from fear. This court is not here to protect feelings of control. It is here to protect fairness. The lawyer sat down heavily, his earlier confidence fading. The inspectors whispered to each other, but their shoulders slumped. Mark closed his binder. He had said what needed to be said. Now the decision rested with the judge. After reviewing the documents for several minutes, the judge spoke firmly. This case has shown clear problems. The association has fined homeowners without written standards. That is not lawful. Mr. Mark has presented strong evidence that he complied with all rules available to him. Therefore, the fines against him cannot stand. A wave of relief washed over the benches. Anna clasped her hands, and David let out a long breath. Clara whispered, finally, justice. The judge continued. This matter may not end here. I advise the association to review its methods carefully, or more cases may follow. For now, the claim against Mr. Mark is dismissed. The gavel struck, and the case was closed. Mark felt calm, almost quiet inside. He had not shouted or argued with anger. He had simply stood firm with truth, and the truth had spoken for itself. The inspectors rose slowly, their faces red with defeat. The lawyer packed his papers quickly, avoiding everyone's eyes. As Mark walked out of the courtroom, his neighbors gathered around him. Anna smiled. You did it. You showed them they cannot push us anymore. David added, you stood for all of us, not just for yourself. Mark nodded. It was not only my fight. It was for fairness. We must remember that rules are meant to guide, not to control unfairly. Outside the courthouse, the sun shone bright on the steps. The group stood together, not as individuals facing fear, but as neighbors who had seen justice with their own eyes. For Mark, the matter was not about winning or losing. It was about proving that even ordinary people could stand against unfair power when they chose truth over fear. And in that moment, he felt stronger than ever before. The courthouse steps were filled with sunlight as Mark and his neighbors walked out together. Their faces carried relief, and some even smiled for the first time in weeks. The inspectors and their lawyer exited quietly on the other side, their shoulders low, their voices hushed. They avoided eye contact with anyone, as though the defeat had pressed down on them. For Mark, the feeling was not joy or triumph but calm strength. He had faced the pressure, and he had not bent. His neighbors had stood with him, and together they had seen the truth win. Yet he also knew this was only the beginning. The decision in court was clear, but the association would not forget the humiliation they had suffered. That evening, Mark sat on his porch. The sky glowed orange as the sun set, and the air was filled with the sound of cicadas. Anna came across the street carrying a plate of fresh bread. "You deserve this," she said with a warm smile. "You gave all of us courage." Mark thanked her and shared the bread with David and Clara, who soon joined. They sat on the porch steps, eating and talking. For the first time in a long while, the conversation was light. They laughed about small things, and the heavy cloud that had hung over their street began to lift. But even as they laughed, David's voice turned serious. "The inspectors will not forget. They may try again with someone else. We should be ready." Mark nodded. "Yes. That is why we must stay united. If they target one of us, all of us must stand together." The next week proved his words true. The inspectors did not return to Mark's house, but rumors spread quickly that they had visited other parts of the neighborhood. One family received a letter about their roof, another about a tree branch, and yet another about a garden shed. Yet this time, something was different. Instead of paying quietly, these families came to Mark. One evening, a man named Robert knocked on his door holding a letter in his hand. "They say my shed is too large," Robert said. "But I looked in the handbook, and there is no rule about shed size. What should I do?" Mark invited him in and explained calmly. "Keep the letter. Copy the page of the handbook that shows no such rule. If they fine you, keep it as evidence. And remember, you are not alone. We all stand together now." Word spread quickly that the association had lost in court. Neighbors began to share their stories openly. At night, small groups gathered on porches to compare letters, rules, and fines. People who once felt isolated now felt part of something larger. Fear slowly turned into confidence. The inspectors, however, walked the streets with less authority than before. Their visits were watched carefully, and homeowners no longer bowed their heads. Instead, they asked sharp questions. "Show me the rule," they demanded. "Where is it written?" Without answers, the inspectors looked weaker each time. The lawyer, too, lost his usual air of confidence. A few weeks after the court case, he attended a community board meeting to speak on behalf of the association. But when neighbors filled the room, holding copies of their handbooks and letters, his words faltered. He promised changes, but his voice carried no force. Mark did not attend every meeting, but his name was spoken often. To many, he had become the example that ordinary people could resist unfair power. He did not seek attention, but he accepted it quietly, knowing the story was bigger than himself. One afternoon, Clara stopped by with her folder of mailbox fines. "I want to challenge these," she said. "If you could stand up in court, then maybe I can too." Mark smiled gently. "Yes, you can. And you will not stand alone." The strength of the neighborhood grew day by day. Instead of silence, there were voices. Instead of fear, there was unity. Even the children felt it, running freely in the yards without hearing worried whispers from their parents. Still, Mark remained cautious. He knew the association had power, and power rarely gave up quietly. But he also knew something more important: power without fairness could not last. The inspectors could no longer frighten people with empty threats, because the truth had already been shown in court. Late one evening, as Mark sat on his porch, David joined him. They looked at the quiet street, the fences, the trees, and the lights shining from windows. "It feels different now," David said. Like the street is stronger. Yes, Mark agreed. Because we learned we do not have to stand alone. Together, we are harder to break. The night was calm, and the oak tree swayed gently in the wind. Mark leaned back, feeling peace settle in his chest. He knew more challenges would come, but he also knew that when neighbors stood side by side, inspectors and lawyers could no longer frighten them. And in that simple truth, he found hope for the days ahead.